Testament Stories 3. Stories of Gideon. The Dew on the Fleece. All the little children I know want to be soldiers. Most of them want to be captains. One has to be brave and stand up very straight to be a captain. Whoever saw a captain bent over like a hook? This story is about a soldier who was a captain. His name was Gideon, and he was a Hebrew. In his country the people were always fighting. All the Hebrew people were dreadfully afraid of their wicked neighbors. No longer did the poor Hebrews dare to live in their tents and stay in their houses. Many of them had hidden themselves in dark, damp caves, those big holes in the rocks that are always so cold. When their wheat grew tall and was ready to reap, their bad neighbors stole it. When the Hebrews had no wheat, they, of course, could not make flour and could not have any bread. And what do you suppose happened to their clothes? The Midianites, their wicked neighbors, stole their sheep so that the Hebrews could not have warm clothes, woolly sheepskins for blankets or for coats. They were very, very miserable, cold and hungry and homeless. Gideon would not run away and hide in a cave. He stayed in his father's house. He hid his wheat so that he could make flour out of it. One time, when he was thrashing his wheat, he had a wonderful visitor. Gideon called him the angel of Jehovah. It was the best kind of name for the visitor. He had such great news for Gideon that I am sure he must have been an angel. The angel told Gideon that because he was brave and strong, God wanted him to go and drive away all the wicked neighbors who were making the Hebrews so unhappy. Gideon's father and brother would not help him. They all worshipped idols, and they did not love God. Before he could conquer the bad neighbors, Gideon would have to do something that would make many of his friends angry. He must throw down every stupid wooden idol. Gideon did not like these idols. He must have thought they were nothing but dolls. Idols look very much like dolls. Gideon knew Jehovah, the real God, was better than these stupid wooden things. Gideon's bad neighbors, his father and brothers, prayed to these idols, but Gideon prayed to Jehovah. That is why the angel visited him. One very dark night, when the moon was playing hide-and-seek with some black clouds, and the stars were too sleepy to shine, Gideon, with a few men, threw down and broke in pieces every wooden idol. When morning came and the people all gathered together to pray to their idols, but oh, how terribly frightened they were! Every one of their idols was gone. The people probably expected the sun to fall out of the sky because Gideon had taken those wooden sticks and made a big bonfire of them. Gideon did not want his people to live in caves any longer. The angel Jehovah would help all the Hebrews to live in their tents and houses again if they would stop thinking that silly idols could help them or harm them. "You must go and drive away your cruel neighbors," the angel had told him. "God is with you, and he will help you, Gideon." "Will God give me the victory?" Gideon asked. Then he did a strange thing. He had a beautiful fleece, a soft, woolly sheepskin. I think Gideon had never worn it when he slept out on the cold hill. I do not believe he had ever used it as a blanket. The fleece must have been very clean and as white as snow. The strange thing Gideon did was to bring out this soft, lovely fleece and lay it on the ground. Did you ever walk barefoot through the grass early in the morning when every blade of grass shone sparkling with dewdrops? How nice it feels to push your feet through the cool water drops on the grass. Gideon loved the early morning and the glistening dewdrops that came with it. It was night time when he put his fleece on the ground. He said, "If there is dew on the fleece in the morning, and not a drop on the ground, I shall know that God wants me to go and conquer our bad neighbors. When morning came, there was so much dew on the fleece it glistened, as though it were covered with diamonds, but the grass had no dew on it at all. "I'm going to make one more trial," said Gideon. "Tonight I shall put the fleece out again. If in the morning the fleece is dry and all the grass is wet, I shall be perfectly sure that God wants me to drive away our wicked neighbors, the Midianites." The fleece was dry in the morning, but sparkling dewdrops glistened on every blade of grass and dripped from every leaf and twig. Gideon was sure now that God wanted him to go. If all those wicked, troublesome Midianites were driven out of the country, the Hebrews would dare come out of their caves and live in their tents and houses again. Gideon did drive the Midianites away, so far away that they never troubled him any more, nor while he lived did they try to torment the Hebrews. These wandering desert people, the Midianites, who had no homes of their own, but who made their living by robbing the homes of others, did not want to be whipped again by the brave soldier Gideon. How Gideon chose his soldiers. Gideon must have soldiers. Brave as he was, he could not fight battles alone. Where would he get soldiers? From the Hebrew people, of course. They were the ones who had to keep hiding from the troublesome Midianites. When Gideon called for soldiers out of the men marching to meet him, over the plains along the riverside and clambering down steep mountainsides they came. Each man must have shouted as he ran. In those long ago days, every army had a war cry. When the soldiers all shouted together, it made such a noise among the hills that sometimes the enemy army was much frightened and ran away. That saved a great deal of fighting. Gideon was both wise and brave. He knew that these big, strong soldiers needed something more than powerful muscles. Suppose the great army of the Midianites should frighten them. How much fighting would they do then? Not any that would help win the battle. Gideon meant to win, and his helpers must fight with him. He must choose only brave, really brave soldiers. He didn't like cowards. Some little folks call them "fraidy cats," any more than you or I do. Besides, God is with brave people. Those are the people he likes to help. Gideon wanted his soldiers to learn a lesson, and what do you suppose that lesson was? That it was not strong hands and arms, spears and swords, which gave soldiers the victory. It was only faith in God that really helped them. Gideon did something odd. His people must have thought he was always doing strange things. I presume they found fault with him, and perhaps called him foolish. But his foolish acts always turned out to be very wise ones. The first thing our brave captain did was to send back to his home every soldier who was afraid. I know you will be surprised when I tell you that more than half of those soldiers decided not to fight, and still Gideon was not sure that every one he still had was a brave soldier. You remember, he was hard to satisfy. He always needed more than one sign. He used his beautiful fleece twice before he would believe that God meant him to be a captain. Now he was going to test his soldiers twice before he would lead them to battle. And this is the strange thing Gideon did after so many of his soldiers had left his army. He asked all who remained to come down with him to the brook. The brook was called the Spring of Trembling. This is just the right name for it because every man who trembled at this spring was sent home. It was here Gideon chose all his real soldiers, those who would stick by him and fight till the battle was won. 10,000 of them went down to the brook. That is more than you can count. The next time you go outdoors at night and look up at the sky, you will see it filled with twinkling stars. The men who went with Gideon to the brook were twice as many as the stars we can see. "Drink," said Gideon to the men, and they did. Some dropped down to their knees. They must have put their faces into the brook and sucked up the water with their lips. Others dipped up the water with their hands and lapped the water from them as a dog laps. Only 300 of the men drank this way, and these were the 300 Gideon chose for his soldiers. Do you know why? I suspect Gideon thought that those who lapped from their hands had good, steady arms which did not tremble from fright. "That is the kind of soldier for me," Gideon must have said. "A very, very odd way to choose soldiers, isn't it?" "I can't be hindered," Gideon must have thought. So the tremblers were sent home. What a dream did for Gideon! The Midianites were making dreadful trouble for everybody, and especially for the Hebrews. They kept moving most of the time, skimming across the desert on soft horses or racing on their fleet dromedaries was the only kind of work these Arabs wanted to do. But they needed something to eat and clothes to wear. How could you get these good things if they would not work? From their neighbors who lived in towns, who had houses and raised wheat and cattle for food. The Hebrews worked and had the good things these fierce Arabs wanted. So into the Hebrews' country came the Arab robbers. Their shabby black goatskin tents were pitched all over the beautiful plain, once covered with fields of wheat, fruit trees, and fine fat cattle. The wheat fields of the Hebrews made rich pastures for the Arab camels and lean cattle. The Hebrews' goats and sheep were stolen from them in order that the Arabs could have more skins for their tents and warm wool for their clothes. Gideon was going to drive away these bad neighbors, he with the 300 men he had chosen by the brook. When the sun set that night, he and his helpers must have peered over the cliffs and looked into the valley below. What a noisy crowd was there! So many camels and so many men that it would take you a whole hour to count them. But Gideon was not going to try to fight them. God had taught him a better way, and by this better way he was going to save his people from these terrible visitors from the desert. It must have been a dark, cloudy night, with no moon and few stars, when Gideon and his servant Purah went softly down the mountainside to visit the Arab camp. The watchmen set the guard the camp were telling each other stories. One Arab soldier had had a strange dream. While he told his dream, the soldier and his companions must have been pacing back and forth in the glow of the watch fire. Gideon could see them in the firelight, while he and Purah lay still in the shadow of the rocks. Not an Arab knew that brave Gideon was near. This was the soldier's dream. He had seen a cake of barley bread fall into the Arab camp, and this cake had broken down a tent. "That means," exclaimed his listeners, "that Gideon is going to destroy our army." Back went Gideon and Purah. Their feet must have had wings on them. They went so fast. Gideon was happy. He had learned that the Arabs were afraid of him. He knew that people who are afraid are easily beaten. Out he called his 300 warriors. In one hand each of them carried a pitcher with a burning torch inside it. In the other hand each one held a trumpet. These trumpets could make a great noise. When they were blown out among the hills, it would sound as if there were 10 times 300 trumpets. Quietly down the mountain side the men crept with Gideon. 100 of the men went to one side of the Arab camp. Another 100 went to the other part of the camp. The 300 Hebrew warriors made a circle round the Arab camp. Not a sound was heard, nor the flash of a torch seen. It was about 10 o'clock at night. The Arab robbers probably were asleep. Perhaps some were dreaming about the barley cake. Others may have smacked their lips as they dreamed of the fine fat sheep they would take from the Hebrews the next morning. Suddenly, all around them flashed lights as Gideon's 300 men smashed their pitchers. The startled Arabs must have thought their whole camp was breaking to pieces. 300 trumpets shrieked out in the dark night as Gideon and his men shouted, "For Jehovah and for Gideon!" Then there was a stampede among the Arab army. "Let us run away before we are all killed by these Hebrews," was probably what every Arab was thinking. And run they did. It was so dark they could not tell an Arab from a Hebrew. So they drew their swords and began to fight one another. The great Arab army killed its own soldiers. Cattle and camels, sheep and goats were left behind the fleeing Arabs. Tents were torn down and the soldiers rode past on their way back to the desert. Out from the caves where they had been hiding swarmed the Hebrews, following close after Gideon and his 300 men, who were chasing the frightened Arabs. Down the hills, across the plains, and beyond the river swept the Arab hosts. Many of them never returned to their desert homes. They were slain by their own swords and by the Hebrew warriors. Gideon had saved his country. Stories of Jotham and Samson. King of the Trees. If you and I were walking on a hot summer day, I'm sure each of us would choose the shady side of the road where plenty of big trees were growing. There are so many, many kinds of trees. Tall ones, which reach up and prick holes in the clouds, and short ones, which make us stoop to walk under them. There are some trees whose branches hug tightly to the mother trunk, and others which spread out their boughs and shake their leaves, trying to tell people to come and rest under their pleasant shade. Some trees grow tired and sleepy like little folks, are only awake in the summertime, while others keep on their dresses of green needles all the year round like our Christmas tree. If I should tell you that once the tree wanted a king, I know all of you would at once shout, "We know the king of the trees. It is the Christmas tree." You have all guessed wrong. When the trees chose a king, there never had been a Christmas day nor a Christmas tree. You remember brave Gideon and how he saved the Hebrews from the Midianites? The people afterward asked Gideon to be their king, but he did not want to wear a crown. "God is your king," Gideon told them. When Gideon died, the people were determined to have a king, and they elected Abimelech, his son, who was a wicked man. Jotham, another son, good like his father, but not so brave, had to run away and hide because the people tried to kill him. But before he hid himself, Jotham told the people and his brother Abimelech a story about the trees choosing a king, and here is the story. The trees wanted a king and went to the olive tree and asked it to reign over them. The olive was not a bit pleased by the request. Its rich oil and good fruit, which every one enjoyed, were much better than being king. "Why should I give up all my fatness whereby I give pleasure to people, just to move my branches over a lot of trees?" the olive asked. Although the beautiful olive had refused to be their king, the trees were not discouraged. The fig tree perhaps would like to be king, but again the trees were mistaken. The fig tree would not listen to them. Its delicious fruit fed many hungry people, and giving food to hungry folks was very much better than just waving its branches over a whole forest of trees. The trees were having a hard time finding a king. No tree that was useful or good or anything wanted to be king. "Let us ask the vine," they all said. Off to the vine they went and offered it a royal crown. Think of it, the beautiful vine bearing luscious grapes, from which came sparkling wine. Every Hebrew loved the vine and wanted one of his own. The useful vine scorned being made king, as had the fig and the olive. Finally, the only one left for the tree to ask to be king was the ugly, prickly bramble, and they were foolish enough to choose it. Of course, the good-for-nothing bramble gladly accepted and became king of the trees. But fire will come out of the bramble and destroy you, Jotham added, when he had finished his story. Then down the mountain-side he ran to a place of safety, where neither his wicked brother Abimelech nor the foolish Hebrews could reach him. What a strange story for a man to tell. Big grown-ups, isn't it? Little children would not be surprised to hear the trees wanted a king, but big folks know better. Why didn't Jotham tell the pretty parable to the little folks? Because he wanted to teach the Hebrews a lesson. He wanted to show them that they were exactly like the foolish trees when they chose his wicked brother for their king. But Gideon, like the fig tree, had refused to be king. Now tell me, all of you, who was the bramble? Yes, you are right. It was the wicked Abimelech, and the wickedness, like a destructive fire, did come out of him and destroy the foolish Hebrew people who had made him king. Samson, the Sun Man. Suppose you and I went walking and looked in at the shop windows. What would you most want to see? Those wonderful walking and talking dolls, and those fine fire wagons with their shiny gongs? We would stop and pick out the prettiest doll and the biggest fire wagon for our very own. Suppose a big man should come along the street while you and I were looking at the shop windows. What would you think if he should reach out his hand, pick up the great building, shop and all, and throw it across his shoulder? Then suppose he should march off with it as though it were no heavier than a sack of popcorn. I think your eyes would almost pop out of your head. You would be so astonished. There once was a man named Samson. Some people called him Little Sun, because he was so strong. He did very wonderful things, things just as strange as picking up a big store and walking off with it. He never was afraid of anything because nothing was as strong as he. If he were walking in a lonely road and met a hungry lion, do you think that he would run away? No, indeed. Once a savage lion did jump out at him. Samson's strong hands took hold of the wild beast as though it were only a chicken and tore it apart. People were afraid of this strong man. It was foolish for them, for Samson did not mean to hurt anyone. He liked to have people see how strong he was, that was all. If people had teased him kindly, he never would have hurt them. But they were not kind, they were cruel. Sometimes when he visited people, they bound his hands and arms with heavy ropes. It did no good. Samson snapped the rope as though it were only a piece of thread. One day Samson went into a large city called Gaza. It had high, strong walls round it and thick, heavy gates, or doors in the walls. Every night these gates were shut and bolted, just as we all shut and lock the doors of our houses at night. Our cities, yours and mine, don't have walls round them. The gates of walled cities were large and strong. Some of the gates were so heavy that it took more than 10 men to open one gate. The people who lived in Gaza were sure that their walls were so high and their gates so strong that Samson never would be able to get out of their city. But he played a great joke on them. One night when the people were all asleep, and when even the dogs had stopped barking and crawled into their kennels, Samson went down to the city gates. He did not want to stay any longer in Gaza. The gates were locked. A heavy iron bar was across them. Anyone but Samson would have had to wait until morning before he could get out. But not Samson. He put his hands under the great gates, lifted them from their big hinges, and flung them across his shoulders. Then off he started and carried them to the top of a high hill. When the city people awoke in the morning, their gates were gone, and so was Samson. How the oxen must have pulled, and the men shouted when the heavy gates were dragged down the hill and set up in the wall again. Everyone tried to find out what made Samson so strong. A woman named Delilah said she would find out, and she did. Samson foolishly told her that he was strong because he had long hair. One night when he was asleep, Delilah cut off his hair. Poor Samson! As soon as his hair was gone, he was weak, so weak that people were able to lock him up in prison. You and I know that if we have our hair cut off, it will grow again. Samson's did. The silly people never thought of that. As Samson's hair grew long again, he began to become strong. These wicked people treated him cruelly. They invited him to their feasts, but gave him nothing to eat. They only laughed at him and made fun of him. One day the Philistines had a great feast in the temple of their fish god, Dagon. They brought Samson in to amuse them. They placed him between the pillars, probably the strong columns which held up the roof. "Let me feel the pillars upon which the house rests," he said to the boy who held his hand. Grasping the two middle pillars, he gave them a mighty pull. Down he bowed with all his might as he held the pillars. Crack, crash! In fell the roof and the temple walls, burying Samson and his tormentors in ruin.